Excellent. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us. I'm going to start our webinar here. It's the afternoon where I am in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is the third presentation in our fall series about allyship, gender-based violence, and working with newcomers, immigrants, and refugees. And today we're talking about engaging men and boys. I'd like to start by giving the land acknowledgement. Our community center, YMCA Center, is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We're all treaty people. I have the honor today of introducing the guest speakers and our partnership group members. And first I'll go over a few housekeeping items. We will be sending you a copy of today's presentation. The slides are very informational, and that's so that you can have them as a handout at the end. Also, feel free to take breaks and be comfortable in your space. Talking about gender-based violence impacts many people, and thinking about it, we need to be mindful of self-care and care for each other. We have French interpretation available on our event conference line, so the presentation is being simultaneously interpreted with in French. And so in our partnership group, we're working together on a cross-Canada project to raise awareness and create tools and resources, as well as a strategy about gender-based violence and working with newcomers, immigrants, and refugees. This is our fifth webinar presentation. We had 2 in the spring and 3 this fall. The other presentations are housed on our project website, which we launched just on the 25th of November, so I can send the link to that too. It's actually in the presentation. So that was the International Day to End Violence Against Women, and we're now in the 16 days of activism. If you've attended before, then you know our project team. I'll do some brief introductions, but there is a handout that is attached to your GoToWebinar platform that gives longer bios of the speakers and the partners. But I would like to introduce Erin Whitmore, the Executive Director of the Ending Violence Association of Canada. She's in Ottawa. Margarita Pintin Perez is the Senior Coordinator for the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence at OCASI in Toronto. And Lauren is another member of our group. She's managing the Women's Awakening program at Elmwood Community Resource Center. And I'm Catherine, working at YMCA Immigrant Services in Nova Scotia. Today's moderator is Selena Abji. She's been working with us as the research consultant on the project and helping facilitate these webinars, and we really appreciate her guidance and support. And we're excited that guest speakers are joining us today. So I'm going to introduce them now with a little bit longer presentation about their experience and knowledge. So Abbas Mansi has worked for over 13 years in the areas of engaging men and boys in violence prevention and gender equity and community development as a researcher and project manager. He's worked on initiatives with the United Nations, local governments, and nonprofit organizations in Guyana, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Canada. He's a founding member of the Alberta Men's Network, which is a diverse community of Albertans committed to nonviolence and working across the gender spectrum to create healthy families and communities. Amanda Koyamo and Noureddin Usakrain are from the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. And they offer, it's a nonprofit organization that offers settlement and integration support and services to all immigrants and refugees in Calgary and Southern Alberta. Amanda has spent the majority of her professional career in the public sector with a focus on access and engagement. With more than 15 years of leadership and strategic management experience that involves process design, stakeholder engagement, and the client experience, Amanda is often solicited to provide board and committee leadership in varying networks. She's a key informant in our needs assessment. Noor is the manager of the Cultural Brokerage Program at Calgary Catholic Immigration Society in partnership with Calgary Children's Services. Noor is a devoted community volunteer for over 10 years and has dedicated most of his professional career to supporting newcomers. Noor's professional experience includes program management, design, supervision, and community engagement. He's an active volunteer with the Calgary Foundation and the Workers Resource Center and holds an MBA from University of Vancouver Island. Fadi Hamdan is a leader in youth settlement work, having led a variety of related programs and events at the YMCA since 2007. As a youth outreach coordinator, Fadi has developed and delivered direct services to youth and built community partnerships and networks, which have contributed to effective settlement experiences and practices. In his current role as manager of child and youth settlement, he's focusing on integrating multiple programs and activities related to children and youth, which support successful school integration, academic success, parent engagement, and healthy child development. These work experiences, in conjunction with representing the YMCA on many community boards and committees, have contributed to his commitment and passion for engaging youth and the community in meaningful ways that promote mutual growth and learning. And we also have today Rekha Gadia from the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. Rekha holds a Master of Arts degree from India and a Master of Business Administration from Nova Southeastern University in Florida. Rekha has been working as the Family Services Department Manager at the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association for over 11 years. She's passionate about her work in the human services sector, particularly in the area of domestic violence prevention and removing settlement barriers for newcomer women. Rekha also has over 18 years of volunteer experience in the nonprofit sector, which includes being the past co-chair of the Ethnoculturally Diverse Communities Committee with the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective, past coordinator of North America Youth Activities, and current coordinator of women's activities for a socio-spiritual charity organization. Rekha holds great pride for being able to give back to the community through supporting immigrant women and their families facing settlement experiences. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming the guest speakers today. I really appreciate that they could join us. And now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Selena.
Thanks, Catherine. And our speakers, feel free to turn off your videos for now until we call you back up. So hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here once again. Those of you who may have joined our previous webinars might know that this is the last in our fall series on practicing allyship with newcomer, immigrant, and refugee communities when it comes to gender-based violence awareness and support. And so just quickly, you know, the first webinar, and these are all recordings are available on the website, as Catherine mentioned. The first webinar in October really introduced the concept of allyship and discussed practical strategies for allyship with newcomer women and girls. In the second webinar, we expanded our focus to consider allyship strategies when working with 2S LGBTQIA+ newcomers. And today we're really expanding the focus again, this time to consider allyship strategies when working with newcomer men and boys. This series is introductory, really intended for frontline workers in settlement and anti-violence sectors. And so when it comes to engaging men and boys, we know that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by sexual and gender-based violence, but we know also that men and boys can experience gender-based violence. And we're going to talk about that a little more in the presentation. So it's important to think about how we can practice allyship as service providers with male-identified survivors of gender-based violence. At the same time, we know that newcomer men and boys experience multiple forms of oppression. So in this series, we've talked about racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of oppression that newcomer communities experience. And so when practicing allyship with newcomer communities, we want to ensure that our approaches are always anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, applied with cultural humility, regardless of the gender identity or sexual identity of the clients that we work with. And so for today's webinar, we've invited a number of experts, as you've just seen, who are working with newcomer men and boys around issues of sexual and gender-based violence. And we've invited them to share with us some of the strategies that they're currently using. And so turning now to the learning objectives for today. Just briefly, as Catherine mentioned, a copy of the slides will be shared, and the slides are information heavy. This is introductory. It's meant to be shared as a resource that you can refer to later on. And also just a reminder for those of you who may have joined a little later, we encourage you to take breaks when you need because the topic can be heavy. So please, please practice self-care as much as you can. The recording will be available for you to refer to later. You can also post any questions in the question feature, and we'll do our best to respond during the webinar or in a follow-up. Okay, so what can you expect in today's webinar? Well, by the end of the webinar, our participants will be able to explain the importance of engaging men and boys who are newcomers, immigrants, and refugees in GBV awareness and prevention work. And as I mentioned, we want to do this in ways that are anti-racist, anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, and practiced with cultural humility. And how do we do this? What are you going to walk away with? Well, with an understanding of the different ways that settlement and anti-violence workers can engage newcomer, immigrant, and refugee men and boys. We also like to be practical in what we share. So by the end, you should have some practical strategies that you can potentially apply in your local region when it comes to raising GBV awareness, information referral, intervention, and a little bit of prevention with men and boys as applicable to your role and context. And finally, we always end with access to additional training and resources that might be helpful as you move forward in doing this work. So let's start with part one of the webinar. And before getting into some of those strategies that you can apply, we're going to start with a little bit of foundation work. For those of you that have attended previous webinars, this is a nice refresher. But really, we're going to talk about some of the key concepts that are forming the basis of today's webinar. And I'm going to hand it over to Margarita, who's going to start us off with a primer on allyship.
Great, thank you, Selena. I'm having a very sunny day today in my apartment, but not the best for the lighting in here. So to start, as Selena said, it's good to think of some of the foundations and the key concepts that we've been using across the different webinars. So to start, what is an ally? An ally, let's think of an ally as an individual who's thinking about the collective good, participating in the struggle to end oppression. And to do so means that the role of an ally is to learn, to unlearn, to really try to think deeply and understand power and oppression and the ways in which they may be benefiting from unearned privileges. In Anne Bishop's book, Becoming an Ally, she really emphasizes and explains how a central aspect of being an ally is recognizing and being aware of one's own role in a system of oppression. So when we think about becoming an ally, if we move to the next slide, please. So if we think about becoming an ally, let's think about allyship in practice. In doing the work to be an ally, we have to reflect and dig deeper in understanding power and privilege and understanding ourselves in relation to power and privilege. Sometimes it can feel bad or we can feel guilty, but I think it's also important for us to think as aspiring allies that we need to learn to separate guilt from responsibility. So guilt can mean that when we're thinking about these deep issues around power and privilege, we might be taking on the weight of this oppression and this work at an individual level, while responsibility means accepting our share of the challenge of changing the situation. So that means when we think about that work, it's lifelong. And as much as it can feel, as I mentioned, can feel uncomfortable, it can also be rewarding to be part of that greater good in the struggle to end oppression. If we move on to thinking then about power and privilege. So power and privilege are key concepts when we're thinking about becoming an ally. Something to reflect on and I think is really helpful when we think about power and privilege is some distinctions. So we might have good intentions. At an individual level, we might be challenging prejudice, trying to challenge stereotypes. These are all good things. But when we continue to dig deeper in thinking about power and privilege, we need to also understand that these are parts of systems of power, right? When we think of racism, if we think of sexism, those are systems of power. So it impacts us all and it provides certain privileges. And so when we think about power, we're thinking about these systems. And so as much as it's important to be holding, these positions about challenging prejudice, not engaging in individual acts, for example, of racism, we also just need to think about how the power of these systems is actually maintained through systems and practices. It's institutionalized, and the people that we are hoping to ally with, provide allyship, are made vulnerable through these systems and institutions. So an ally is then someone who's doing this work at their individual level, seeing their responsibility, thinking about ways of learning and reflecting. And what you're seeing here up on the screen is just thinking about that social location that you have, where you're at, thinking about that kind of social location, thinking about privilege, and then thinking deeper around the oppressive kind of systems that organize our world. If we move on to the next slide, please. If we think then about our active allyship with newcomer, immigrant, and refugee communities, it's really critical for us to learn about the immigration system and, moreover, really think critically about immigration status. So what you're seeing up on the slide are kind of key immigration terms that we might be using, or that we do use, sorry. So we think about permanent resident, refugee, a person without status, or non-status person. And these terms, why they're so important is because they refer to different categories and pathways that are created for people to enter, reside, visit, work, and study in Canada. So if we think about the immigration system, we're thinking about pathways that are available to immigrants and newcomer communities, but we're also thinking about how this immigration system can expose people to challenges and vulnerabilities. It can determine who has access and eligibility to certain types of supports and programs, right? So that's when we're thinking as allies, as lifelong learners, as allies to the newcomer, immigrant, and refugee community. It also means taking time to learn about this immigration system and think about it as an immigration system that's a system of power that implicates the groups that we are supporting in profound ways. Next, I'll pass it on to Erin.
Great, thank you, Margarita. And so the next term that we want to just speak about briefly to set up the conversation for today is gender-based violence. And the phrase gender-based violence is one that's commonly used as an umbrella term or kind of a general term to refer to violence that's committed against someone based on their gender identity or expression or perceived gender. And it's important to acknowledge that the terminology and the language used to describe various forms of gender-based violence has evolved, and it continues to change and shift over time and is used in different ways in different contexts. So you may hear people speak about different forms of gender-based violence, such as family violence, domestic or intimate partner violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and many other forms of gender-based violence. Another point that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about a sort of a definition of gender-based violence is that when we're talking about gender-based violence, we're talking about violence that occurs as a consequence of living in systems in which there are unequal power relationships, in which some people have more privilege and power over others, as Margarita was just speaking about. Gender-based violence occurs when that privilege and power is used over others to commit violence and often to further that power and control. So when we think about different forms of gender-based violence, we may often think about something that happens between two individuals. But we want to remember today in our presentation that this violence really can't be disconnected from the systems and structures in which people live. And so when we're talking about gender-based violence, we also need to be thinking about how violence takes place at a systemic or structural level, and how systems and structures that we live in, such as colonialism, the immigration system, and the justice system, can create conditions that make gender-based violence possible. And so we'll just move to the next slide. And so when we're thinking today about practicing allyship in the specific context of gender-based violence focused work with immigrant, newcomer, and refugee communities, particularly as frontline service providers, it's helpful to think about some of the general ways that those who may be seeking support might face barriers in accessing that support, and then also to be aware of some of the distinct factors that can make seeking and navigating support even more difficult for newcomer, refugee, and immigrant communities. So we know that for anyone, reaching out to support in the aftermath of gender-based violence can be quite scary. It requires a lot of courage. It can be confusing and difficult to know where to go and who to trust. And we know that for immigrant, refugee, and newcomer communities, this can be even more challenging. Often individuals can feel isolated, and they can face a lot of challenges in kind of breaking that isolation, particularly if community resources are not available in ways that are accessible or easily navigated. We also want to think about how, for many gender-based violence survivors, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, for people to experience situations where they are questioned or not believed when they disclose experiences of violence. Sometimes this is referred to as victim blaming. And we know that victim blaming can be exacerbated as well by racist and xenophobic beliefs and attitudes that can make seeking support even more challenging and frightening for those who may be subject to those attitudes and beliefs. Certainly, we've heard how reaching out for support for immigrant, refugee, and newcomer communities might be complicated by concerns about how doing so could impact their immigration status, how it might trigger involvement with the child welfare system, or what it might mean if one reaches out to the police. A couple of other barriers that we want to be thinking about in this context also include language barriers, economic barriers, fears again about what reaching out might mean for one's family in a new community. All of these are some of the challenges that immigrant, newcomer, and refugee survivors or family members, those who are wanting to support those impacted by violence, might face, and as allies, situations where we can do important work in helping to minimize and address some of those barriers. And I will pass it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Erin. Really appreciate the overview of gender-based violence forms and barriers, and also Margarita reminding us about allyship. Thanks very much. So I'm turning our attention now to the many ways that service providers work with men and boys. And so in our organizations, we may be interacting with clients or with people that we serve who are men and boys. And these are some examples of ways that we do that. Could be through employment, language, recreation, information orientation activities. Maybe people that we're working with have experienced violence, and that can come up. One time we had a presentation and there were men in the room talking about violence of war that happened, and so we spoke with them about that. They may have experienced childhood violence or gender-based violence, sexualized violence. They may have used violence in their relationships. They may know of family or community members who have experienced gender-based violence, and they may need information about how to support and help them, how to access resources. And we may be working to engage them as allies in violence prevention. A lot of the resources that we have today is around that topic. However, there's a lot of different ways that we could be working with men and boys. So the next slide is a poll. We're asking the audience to consider whether or not you're working with newcomer, immigrant, or refugee men and boys in your programs and services. And Margarita was going to give me a hand with that, or lead that part.
1 second, we'll generate this. All right, the poll has now been launched.
So yeah, the question is, do you work with men and boys in your services, in your programs and services? Yeah.
Just give folks another 30 seconds to complete it. Great. Great. Thank you to everyone who's voted. So about 66% voted, and it looks like 72% responded with yes. It's a good amount.
Yeah, that's a lot of people currently working with men and boys. That's great. Thanks, Margarita. And thanks everyone for participating in the poll. So now Selena is coming back here.
Great. Thanks. Thanks everyone for really grounding us in some of the key concepts and ideas that are informing this series and today's webinar. And so great to see that so many of our participants are already engaging with men and boys in their GBV work or in their settlement work. That's wonderful. So now we get into the crux of the matter, and we've asked our guest speakers to really share with us what kinds of work are they doing and what kinds of strategies are they using to engage newcomer, immigrant, and refugee men and boys when it comes to GBV awareness work. And so without any further ado, I will introduce our first guest speaker, Reka, who's going to walk us through some of the work that she's doing and the important strategies. Thanks, Reka.
Yeah, thanks, Selena. Hi, all. So I'll be talking about some of the myths and facts about gender-based violence in men, and also some of the best practices that we have identified at CIWA, the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association, to engage men and boys. One of the as you can see on the slide, CIWA is a nonprofit organization, registered charity. Without going much into details, as the name suggests, we have a gender-specific mandate. We work with men through the lens of women, which is a very unique lens as well. And if I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I said, I'm going to talk about some of the myths and facts about the practicing allyship with men and boys. So one of the biggest myths is that men don't experience domestic or gender-based violence. But the fact is that, yes, women and girls disproportionately experience the family or gender-based violence. I will interchangeably use the family and gender-based because it is the way we work as well. So, but however, the men and boys can also experience it. And it is often by other men or women in the position of power where the abuse comes from, and it stems into the violence situation. So one of the examples that comes to my mind is for instance, a woman who has sponsored a man to come to Canada and has more power over the man as well. So that could be one example. The other myth is that racialized or immigrant men are more violent than the other men, which we have seen very commonly in our work when I started in my position, for sure. However, my experience and the fact is that violence is not unique to any culture, race, or group. Rather, it is in the systems with deep-rooted patriarchy. Additionally, also in case of, immigrant men, it is also the immigration to a new country, culture, which in itself is a huge factor. The lack of qualification recognition, the pressure to learn new language, skills, role reversal, kids integrating in a fast pace than parents. This all seems like they're losing control and power of their life and presents a huge blow to their self-esteem and masculinity. And this is what truly leads into the family conflict, domestic violence, and malpractices. And one of the analogies I use with the systems here, or to bring this to mainstream's attention, is that, if you change your pillow or your mattress one day, your back is sore the next day. And these individuals are changing their family, their life, the culture, and everything. So there is so much of, at stake for them. So that leads into this situation. So the stress factors are high. Another myth is that our role as service providers is to rescue women from the racialized men. However, our role is actually to ensure we provide the safety planning information, to listen to the needs of the family or the victim, and act as a connector truly to the relevant resources, appropriate services that they need. And also our role is to be an ally, without being a rescuer, using the strategies such as, listening to them with empathy and genuineness instead of taking it over. then connecting them to them with the using the anti-racist and anti-oppressive approaches, also recognizing the needs of their family as a unit and as a holistic, because that's what they are here for, and provide that information in a very non-judgmental and non-biased way. And the biggest thing what we have learned is, avoiding a defensive or a very wounded or angry, dismissive response to the evidence of racism. And now I will speak to some of the best practices that we have narrowed down at CIWA in terms of engaging men. And some of those are like, the very first is the perpetrator engagement. Coming from a very objective lens that no one comes to a new country or starts a life with a goal of becoming an abuser or perpetrator. A lot of it is actually situational violence, in this case particularly hardwired patriarchy, and of course some is coercive control too, but let's not write off the perpetrators, rather engage them in education, and it works. Because at the end of the day, they came to this beautiful country, Canada, for a better future of their kids and family, which wasn't a red flag to begin with, was a rather green one, because they intended good for their family. So let's work off of that premise. Another best practice that we have identified here at CIWA is the counseling support, which is uniquely customized based on where the family is and where the man in that family is, specifically either it's the intervention, prevention, or whichever stage they are at, all leading from the perspective of healing by tapping into the power of moment. It is in the power of moment. Sometimes we can say it is intervention, it is prevention, but I feel strongly that sometimes it is prevention within the intervention. That is the power of moment that they learn the most at that particular moment. And some of those unique counseling strategies we have identified is it could be individual, it could be couple, it could be family counseling, first language, culturally sensitive, which is not new to anyone. The other key piece that we have learned is incorporating spirituality in the counseling, which has worked beautifully well in many of the cases, because without going into too much of a religious aspect, but it is important for a lot of individuals that we work with. So incorporating that really helps them calm down and lets us, go through that path of healing. And then the customized peer support groups, and that is critical for men, as we have identified as well. It could be even in the form of couples, specific ethnic groups, it could be only fathers, it could be men who are involved with children's services, it could be court mandated. So we customize those peer support groups based on, whatever would work best for that individual or the family. And of course, that as a part of the gender-based violence, and when the fathers are there, it is a big impact on the children, and we help them learn that through the lens of their children. So offering the parenting courses along with as a customized support to those individuals. And then of course, making it very accessible to them by going where they are in the community or offering support at their homes. One of the other solid best practice is the coordinated response system that we have identified. And one of the best example I can speak about it is that we have at CIWA is that we have a partnership with the Calgary Police Services for community-based domestic conflict response team, which is called Equally Safe. It is a very unique model, and I believe that has the first in Canada, and it includes the police, the emergency shelter, Kirby Center, which is a seniors focused shelter, YWCA, and Avutan for Indigenous families, and of course, CIWA represents the immigrant portfolio there as a connector, again, right from the triage with the police, children's services, to referring the families to appropriate services and the community resources. One of the biggest achievements or success in this model is that this allows us to influence the system and mainstream organizations through educating them in the process by offering the unique cultural perspectives and insights around the struggles of these men, women, and their families. Given the current landscape with the police services, this particular aspect is truly appreciated by the police system. Another promised practice is, as you can see on the slide, is the strategic partnerships. And some of the examples of these at CIWA includes, partnerships with the police, health services, children's services, multicultural brokerage program that you will hear from our peer in the sector from CCIS, working with shelters, mental health, clinical supports, Alberta Men's Network, and some other organizations like Next Gen Men, we really, take pride in working with those individuals. And organizations, Center for Sexuality, they have their Wise Guys program, which really helps us, look into a different way of truly understanding the issues and deconstructing some of the healthy gender norms as well, and addressing those accordingly. One of the other solid strategy that we have, or best practice, is the connecting to research that we have. That allows us to actually ensure that we are current, well informed about the trends. We have the evidence-based practices, etc., in use. For instance, we participated in the SHIFT research project, engaging men in violence research, prevention research project here at the University of Calgary, and some others at the University of Alberta as well. And you will hear about some of the projects in this presentation as well. And on top of this, we also have internally a national research project that focuses on intersectionality of the gender-based violence and the occupational health and safety. Last but not least is a solid representation at the networks and committees, such as, Men's Action Network in Calgary, Alberta Men's Network, as I talked about, Calgary Domestic Violence Collective. And of course, when I say Calgary, it implies that, it is the local, so you can tap into your local resources and provincial and federal resources. And if I move to the next slide, it is all about, best practices for boys. And a lot of these practices are actually similar for boys. And in the interest of time, I'll only speak to some of the unique strategies specific to boys that are in place and that are not captured in the man one, was working with the schools. So with the school boards that we worked, and we developed a curricula which was focused on gender equity, gender-based violence prevention curriculum, and healthy relationships curriculum. Again, it was developed in the partnership with the Center for Sexuality, who provided a very unique perspective of healthy gender norms and roles, their relevant expertise around the right language, and we offered the insights around the cultural nuances, sensitivities, and stigmas around it. And each year we offer this curricula in 2 to 3 targeted schools. And in the next slide, I will talk about some of the non-traditional tools that, in addition to the evidence-based practices, our best practices, what we have identified are some of the tools and resources that are non-traditional, but they are very effective in conveying some of the messages in a very simplified and casual manner. And this can include ethnic media commercials, articles, movie clips, documentaries. And one such example is the series of, as you can see on the slide, is the Ariel, which is a laundry detergent in India, actually, but they had launched a campaign some time ago called #ShareTheLoad, which conveys a very strong message of engaging boys in doing house chores, doing laundry, sharing the load of the family. And we find this as a very powerful and effective tool to educate the South Asian families. And we constantly strive to be on the lookout for such resources unique for various ethnic groups, cultures, because these are some popular tools that they, popular things, that they are connected to. So let's tap into that. Lastly, I will give you a snapshot of, we have ensured that, as you can see, there are so many programs that we have, and these are some of them, and I will not speak to the programs, but what I will say is we have ensured that, in conclusion, to incorporate all these above mentioned best practices in all of our gender-based and family violence, children's impacted by violence, all those kind of programming. And some of these programs that are listed on the slide are just a part of a larger collection of various other programs and services that use a multi-pronged and ongoing innovative approach. As learning never stops, and as the needs emerge, we keep changing. And that's about my presentation. And now I would like to pass it on to my fellow panelist, Fatty from YMCA.
Daddy, I think you might be on mute.
Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, sorry.
That's often happening. Hi, everybody. I'll repeat myself again. My name is Fadi, and I work with the YMCA Center for Immigrant Programs in Halifax. We are part of the YMCA in Halifax and Dartmouth. I've been with the Y for 13 years as an immigrant myself, a young person who joined the YMCA programs and have been with them since. Our YMCA here is really a community-based program that is really inclusive and welcoming, and really working and try to build a healthy community in the province. But also, we don't do that alone. We were gratefully and happy to do that with a lot of partnerships with community organizations and individuals in the community. And usually when I do these presentations, I try to often in the beginning of talking about some of the challenges that newcomer first in the beginning. So in the next slide, you will see some of the general challenge that newcomer face. First, when they arrive, we know language is a big barrier for a lot of a newcomer. Lonely and isolation, culture shock, lifestyle, unemployment, racism, of course, is a big thing. Weather and access to healthcare, and also just feeling welcome. We know that in Canada, we feel very nice and sweet, and we really welcoming. But usually, often times when we ask a newcomer about how they feel, and the reason when they say they don't feel welcome is really sometimes missing the second step, is really taking the initiative and invest in knowing who really moved next door to you, or who really your neighbor, or who is really sitting in the bus next to you. And in the next slide, you will see some of the challenges that are young people first. As a young person, you are growing, developing mentally and physically, and your view in life, and all of a sudden, here you go, you move to a different country, and it's often not by your choice, it's a family choice. So some of these young people challenges on top of other challenges is really, feeling the pressure of academic and, success in the school, and being the expectation that your family wanted you to be, balancing that cultural identity and, which one I want to be. Should I be more Canadian and lose some of my traditional roots, or should I grab on my traditional roots and then we'll all integrate a little bit slower than others in the community? Shifting family rules is a big deal. Oftentimes when they have a newcomer kids, and especially young boys and men, they often have to go, for example, provide for their family because they learn English faster. So they find a job after school, or they don't have the opportunity to, participate in a recreation activity because they have to do that part of supporting the family. And then also, just making friends and feeling fitted in, it's part of the deals. And then that, the struggle and challenges in the beginning. And then the next slide, you'll see some of the challenges that newcomers face also in the smaller centers. So in the crosshair, for example, in Nova Scotia, in the smaller centers outside of Halifax area, where there's transportation is really limited. So if you don't have a vehicle, you cannot really access community resources or go to community events. And that will really limit it, and making your isolation bubble is really bigger and bigger. There is less diversity and, knowledge about newcomers and different culture in the smaller centers, and also just limited resources in general for newcomers in this area. Like, for example, I say I love shawarma, so if I move to a community that don't have shawarma, I wouldn't be staying there for so long. So it really that play a factor of, sometimes if keeping newcomer families when they live in a smaller center. And as you see in here, in the 3 slides, I combine them together just to show that the bubbles are really different sizes and different in shapes and all that. And because every newcomer experience is really different from a person to another, and how they integrate here and how they experience some of these challenges. So, I have 5 brothers, for example, 6 of us, 6 boys. We really have a different level of English. We have different friends. We have different concepts, different, expectation, how we integrate it here. It's really different, even if we lived in the same household for so long. So that's why I think it's really important when we work with the newcomer families to try to really identify how every newcomer experience is really intersect according to their gender, sexual orientation, where the family, economic, like all that play a factor of how a newcomer, integrate and feel welcome in a community here. So when often, in the next slide, when often, talking about, sorry, a second here. When often we talk about, men and boys, and even like, in Canada, in Halifax here, like, we do, wait a second. I think I can't see the slide anymore. Okay. And then when I was thinking, before Catherine. And so even when we look at the stats here, when we talk about violence and the cases of violence when espousal, even if men are 90% out of this status, it's really also important to note and focus on that not all men and boys are violent. And so that's like a really like you have to try to really remember that often, and really remember and try to focus on the positive example when we try to engage this young men and boys in conversation about healthy relationship, healthy communication, and then well-being, healthy community, and gender-based violence prevention. And in the next slide here, we bring an example of, some of our work here at the YMCA. We've been working with young men and boys for many years, and having the Y guys and gender-specific programming, and really that constantly conversation with young people about healthy relationship, and being part of that conversation is really important. So 2 years ago, Catherine, if you want to go to the next slide, 2 years ago we did have that opportunity to bring 30 kids, 30 young men, for 2 days camp or conference when we talk about gender-based violence prevention. It's really for newcomer. Often this concept is really new, so it's really important for us to really have the opportunity and the time to put an effort on explaining and discussion and challenge some of this concept by really understanding where is everybody coming from. So we really that opportunity for the 2 days is really was great, example of how conversation really help explaining the role of this young men of really limiting violence and be part of the prevention, and talk about consent, and then really the brotherhood concept is really challenging what is it being a man, and what does that mean, and try to really dismantle all the barriers around it too. And some of the things that we did was really positive in that conference is really talk about the meal script. And as I think more often time people re, refer to the meal script or the onion, is really that what is a man. What does it mean to be a man? Like, what does I should look like? What should I speak like? The expectations, so the pressure of being a man. And it's really, we took that opportunity to try to really talk about that, and really, break out of that bubbles, or break out of the script, and really try to discuss in a healthier and more deeper in conversation, and again engage in more how can we become part of the solution, not just the cause of the harm often. And then one of the activity also we did is really, what is it called, the rope circle, when we really have a rope between each other and have one of these young men really walk on the rope, so they will really trust us and rely on us, and it's really like emphasize on the brotherhood concept of that circle. And so in the next slide is really us keep constantly thinking and critical thinking about how we can challenge these concepts, like the meal script, the pressure that we see on social media. I said, for example, me coming as I already had the pressure of being a man in my own culture, and coming to Canada here, I also added on top of that the how to be a man in my in the Canadian culture. For example, I bring the example of us living with our families till we get married. Constantly, like in Canada, we feel like we have to lie about that, just because again that does not represent a man, or that does not reflect on what does a man here looks like. But in our culture, like if we challenge that will really create a lot of conflict between us and our families. And then the next slide, again, we talk about this is some of our programming that we constantly, and we still haven't, even with COVID hit, is really to encourage these conversations with young men and boys about different topics. Again, showing emotion, expressing feelings, talk about healthy relationship, consent. What is the expectation when you meet with partners, and deal with families and loved ones and friends. So really, this conversation continuing, and we have that the Men's Action Project. That's one of the examples that is constantly continually having, even with COVID, doing it virtually. And then in the next slide is we talk about when I know we were talking here, we mentioned a little bit examples about it being ally, and also again how men can be part of the being ally. We understand being ally in general, really listening and learning and validating people's experiences, especially when you work with a newcomer in general. We often say, please listen and validate and learn about newcomer experiences, because everybody, again, experiences are different from one to another. Really recognize your own privileges when you come to conversation. So again, we say an ally is not the superhero, is really being there to stand up and support people who has been discriminated against or being treated unfair in the situation. So it's really recognizing your own privilege as a man when you come to this conversation or this situation, and really understand the cause of gender inequality. And because that's not something happen locally or nationally, this is a universal thing, an issue that happening across the globe, and we have to really keep stand up and being solidarity with the movement when that happens in terms of challenging gender inequality. And again, when we talk about what is the benefit out of this? The benefit out of this is for everybody, not for me and you. It's really the benefit for all of us as a community. Gender prevention and gender equality is really raise the awareness of stronger relationship, stronger and better relationship, and also just a healthy community for everybody. So again, we say often, we cannot, even if our approach here, we cannot do it alone. We need to do it in our community, and everybody needs to be part of this movement, of this challenge, or this prevention. So again, we talk about this as a benefit for everybody. And this is here when I pass along to my colleague, Abbas.
Thank you, Fadi. Hello, everyone. Nice to be part of this webinar. I'll be co-presenting with Veronica, who thankfully was a last-minute addition to help talk about some of the work she's done with the Latino men's group in Calgary. So it's one case study that we'll kind of drill down more into. So I invite Veronica maybe to turn your camera on, Veronica, if you could, and your audio. And maybe if you can give a brief introduction to yourself, since we missed you in the beginning.
Hello, hello everyone. I'm very excited to be here and join with you. I am a social work master student. I'm also mobilizer with the Alberta Men's Network, and I'm a research assistant and volunteer. Thank you, Abbas.
Sweet, thanks, Veronica. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, perhaps. Okay, so I think one of the things you wanted to mention, I should also say that I'm actually a stay-at-home dad, so I'm currently full-time dad duty. So I have my two daughters with me running about. The 5-year-old should have been in kindergarten, but she didn't go today. So if you hear background sounds, it's all part of the ambience. They may pop in, but we'll see. But I have it all under control. But I wanted to start with this concept of intersectionality, because from our experience, we feel that if we don't grasp the concept of intersectionality and incorporate it into the design of our initiatives, the effectiveness of our programs and initiatives would not work as well. I think it's really important to understand the complexity of men's lives, the various identities they have because of race, religion, background, where people come from, the accent people speak. All of these factors makes life for men complex. And because of these intersectionalities and combination of identities, their experiences around masculinity and how they're seen differs. So I think it's really important when we're unpacking masculinity to understand the complexity of the diverse identities men have. And the other point, I think, to add to this, I think it's critical that we don't group or homogenize all men. When we say engage men and boys, it's not one group or one label. There are many diverse men within the community, and I think when we're designing initiatives, we have to design specifically for those particular communities and men, understanding their background, their culture, and how they show up, and all that informs the masculinity that they sort of manifest and demonstrate in the world. Next slide. So Shift, which is a really wonderful project in Alberta that has done some research around working and engaging men and boys in violence prevention, talks a little bit here. I think I like how they explain when we talk about designing and sort of engaging men using an intersectional lens, By this, we mean your initiative should cover a multiplicity of issues. So it should be sort of really provoking intellectual and emotional interest around gender-based violence, what it means to advance gender equity, what does healthy masculinity look like, addressing racism, the phobias, and talking about healthy relationships. And we know that when we design programs, interventions, this could not just be an introductory session. You can't just touch on it. You have to really sort of challenge attitudes, beliefs, and norms in all of these areas. Only then we have found, and research shows, that your intervention and programs will be effective. It's really important to provoke emotional and intellectual response to these topics. You're not introducing it or just covering it. So just wanted to emphasize that point. We can go on. Some other work I think that has been done by Shift in Alberta. So a really wonderful research and article on the entry points to engage in men and boys. So I think this lends on some global data, so particularly from the global south and around the world, of what has been effective to sort of begin to work with men and boys. But this particular article, I think, also really brings it locally. So they presented what they call seven entry points. That I think really provides a good framework of if you're trying to think where do you start, you can pick one or two or three. For example, as a father, if I were to be, if someone was to design an initiative program for men that particularly includes fatherhood, that would really interest me, or particularly my interest in sports like soccer, cricket, and you really interweave those interests with initiatives. I think your programs and initiatives would be a lot more powerful, welcoming, and attractive to men. And the other one I really like, particularly for immigrant, newcomer communities, I think we know that in a lot of these communities, elders and faith-based leaders have important roles. So incorporating those individuals and community members would be key when designing initiatives. So I think this is a great resource to sort of check up and check out their work. We can move on. So here, I want to talk about two case studies that we're really excited to talk about. Veronica will talk about the second one. But one of the things that we sort of did was really focusing in on fathers. And we did two initiatives so far that gathered a lot of community attention. One individual from the network mentioned that, you know, in their community, the relationship between fathers and daughters is something that's frowned upon. In fact, it's not even encouraged. And this really hampers men from stepping into that fatherhood role, and it impacts their relationship with their kids. So we thought the way we can address this was simply to call community to celebrate the relationship. And we sort of mobilized with community members. The women in the community helped to bring the men out. We sort of worked with local leaders. And we began to challenge a narrative around fatherhood in a lot of these communities that really had a really good positive effect. It was fun. It was sort of celebratory in sort of nature. And the feedback we got back from those events was really phenomenal. I think men and women said how powerful it was, and they really valued seeing initiatives that were really nicely designed to attract men. And this was just a really wonderful family experience that I think from the network we've always sort of cherished. So that's one example of what you can do. Veronica, you want to talk about a Latino men's group?
Yes, thank you, Abbas. First, I want to start recognizing that this is part of a collective and many people are involved to make possible this project. Herbert Campos, Marco Lopez, Herbert Campos, Sebastián Benavides, Jeff Halvorsen, Tamara Humphrey. Fanny Oliphant, she is the masterpiece. She's from Mexico and she's part of the Latino community. She developed a program for Latino men well-being. It's a workshop. And we started from the community we invited Latino from friends. They came voluntary. We had 10 sessions. She is the main facilitator, two co-facilitators, that one of them, Marco Lopez, is a collaboration with CIWA, and we have 10 participants. My role was as a research assistant to follow how was these results and benefits for men from the beginning to the end. So I was attending all the session, and I was adopted by the group, and I was welcome. I stayed with them. This is a very special experience that we all live, and including me. We have this meeting in a church. Since the beginning, Fanny created a safe place. We're involved in creating the rules. We have participants of different parts of Spanish speaker countries, because everything was in Spanish, different ages. We had from 20 years old. One of the requirements is that they need to be at least 18 years old. And the oldest one was 50 years old. And we went through reflections from how is the family of origin, how is the stress, and how is physically when as immigrants we come to Canada, and is the weather and is the culture, and also the stress of getting a job, and how it affects physically, and being aware of our own body, and how we can have these strategies and tools to control the stress, to self-care, and how we were deconstructing. This is very important, deconstructing our ideas and decolonizing things that we learn and from our home country. And if we have the results, so if anyone is interested, we in Alberta Men's Network, we have the community brief. We are working on publishing an article, and we can tell you more about it, who is interested. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Veronica. We can move on. Some other work I think we're involved in, and so Alberta Men's Network did a provincial-wide survey of men. Over 2,200 men responded to the survey. And what we did was we sort of drilled into the responses from the South Asian community, South Asian men. So these were some of the things that surfaced from that research, in addition to our experience working with groups. One of the things we know is that many racialized communities, newcomers, immigrants, face compounded challenges of access to opportunity and starting of a new life because of the transition they've made here, because of racism and discrimination they experience. So it's important to understand and recognize that when trying to include and work with these communities and empathizing with their struggle. We also realize that the types of services that exist, we think need to be a bit more creative and cognizant of the lived realities of these groups, specific groups. And to be conscious that in a lot of communities, and echoing some things that were shared earlier, informal peer-based supports and peer role models are often what these men seek out first above formal. We also know that, Veronica touched on this, that helping men to also deconstruct their own masculinity cultures, their own being macho men, that sort of connects well to the patriarchal structures of masculinity here. That needs to be talked about and sort of deconstructed. And this might be the first discussion for some of these men. And we also know that many of these men are healing from past trauma. So really figuring out how to address mental health and promote mental health, and including men in these conversations that will work, I think would be important. We can move on. So just kind of coming up to the end of our presentation, just wanted to highlight some other specific challenges that we have found. I mentioned the survey we did in 2015, when we asked men if they need supports and services for healthy relationships and well-being, overwhelmingly 96% of the men said yes. But when we asked if they know where to go, 3 out of 4 men did not know where to go. They neither know where to go nor whom to approach for appropriate services, in spite of the number of programs and services out there. Now, it's 5 years since, and things may have changed, but still, how we advertise, the words we use, I think we need to be conscious of that. And we know that because of constructs around masculinity, social norms and attitudes prevent men from reaching out. And reaching out and help-seeking behavior is seen as sort of weaknesses and a feminine trait that not many men sort of that would cause many men not to reach out. So men are often uncomfortable accepting that they need help and supports. This makes it difficult sometimes for our programs to reach them. So being really conscious around how we word stuff, how we attract men, how we advertise and design them. We really want to attract men to our services. We can move on. And just some benefits we have found, this may be a bit more universal now from group sessions. We know that when it's structured around peer supports and role modeling, we know that that's attractive and men find that helpful. Not just strict programming, but I think having conversations, spontaneous conversations in groups is really helpful, including men in the conversations about what topics, designs, how things could be applied is really critical. So moving from formal to informal types of programs we found were quite effective. It's important to recognize like birthdays, events, things happening in men's lives, so make it celebratory. Shouldn't all be serious. We know that when we create safe spaces of trust and reciprocity, men open up and they also provide their own means of support with each other. And a lot of these groups and bonds go on beyond the formal time frame of the groups, if done well. And we also know that though you may work with specific cultural groups of men, it's important to consider adding diversity, particularly around facilitators. That would be good, or bringing in guest speakers that sort of reflect the diversity of the community and the society they live in. We could move on. And the last point to really talk about healthy masculinity, and I bring myself into this slide because I mentioned I'm a dad at home with my 2 daughters. I'm currently not working, and we know that it's important to begin to promote healthy masculinity. Here we're talking about health and caring masculinity because it has tremendous benefits on relationships, men's relationships with their wives and kids, but also personal transformation. So when I think this is an emerging concept of transformative masculinity, where we're promoting a type of masculinity that is more caring. So men taking on more sort of roles that have traditionally been seen as left for women to bear alone. But that for me is just encouraging men to be good dads, good partners, good family members, and to sort of challenge men to give up some of those very strict traditional forms and practices of masculinity that are very harmful, not just to other people, but to themselves as well. So what that looks like, that is conversations and encouraging men to sort of share the load, to sort of be more helpful around the home, taking on more caring responsibilities with their kids, doing more domestic duties, and speaking up and sort of treating women publicly and privately with respect and with equity, and sort of taking that stand to do that. And I think more and more men are seeing this as valuable, and I think a new generation is seeing this as part of the definition of masculinity. So I encourage you to sort of jump into this aspect of masculinity. We can move on. Okay, so I wanted to end by saying a lot of this knowledge that I share is brought from community, from the network. So I'm sharing on behalf of that group. So thanks for having us. And I would like to pass you on now to our friends from CCIS, Amanda and Noor.
Thanks, Abbas. Hi, everyone. It's very Western centric in this presentation, hey, coming from Calgary, again, Alberta. You can move forward, Catherine. I want to thank Catherine for inviting me to be part of the panel today, and also just sort of involving us in the presentation the project all the way through. And so given the time constraint and the audience, I really want to focus on the work that we are doing at the intersection of culture and society. And we're a large immigrant serving agency that serves Calgary and Southern Alberta, just for context. Go ahead, Catherine. So I want to make sure that I sort of emphasize the definition we use around family violence, because I think the definitions are really important. And we work only with families in experiencing violence, family violence, and that means all forms of violence. So that's, not just intimate partner violence, but financial, spiritual, abuse on children. And it's for a lot of reasons, but one, because we partnered with one of our local emergency shelters here in Calgary, and that's the language they use, so we adopted their language. Two, in the space that we work, family has a broader definition than traditional, and often in family violence situations and cycles of abuse, there are family members, let's say in a multi-generational household, that could be contributing to the cycle, or even family members from back home that are part of the cycle of abuse. And so we very distinctly use family, and we only work with partners that have children because of this program, the Cultural Brokerage Program, of which some of you might be familiar with. It is also, I just wanted to mention, I have the chat open, and I think audience can submit questions. So if there's questions, please jump in at any time, and I'll keep an eye on that. The Cultural Brokerage Program is a program it's designed in partnership with Children's Services, Child Welfare of Calgary and area. So 6 years ago, they called themselves out and said, we're not doing a very good job for immigrant families that are in our care, and we need to do better. So immigrant families intersecting with the child welfare system. And this was our suggestion to them and our response into, this is how we think you can do better. And so it's a team of 12, 13, well, it varies. As you can see below, it was originally a team of 12. And a cultural broker has two functions, really. One, they're co-located with Children's Services offices. So half their job is to support newcomer families in the child welfare system. And the other half of their job is to support Children's Services in becoming more culturally responsive, which is a big job. And so really half of them are resettlement workers, and half of them they don't have any authority in child welfare, but they have to know the system. And after 2 years of this program, evidence very clearly show that over half of our cases were family violence related. So I kind of always joke around and say I never wanted to go into the family violence space because it's very challenging, but we had no choice because that was what the evidence showed from the needs of our clients. So that's what we're talking about today, is the family violence brokers. Go ahead, please, Catherine. So this is just some information I want to share that all of my fellow panelists have kind of alluded to in working in this space. And because we work in the intersection of culture and family violence, these are some of the barriers that we have seen that also lead us to sort of forge our own path and have our own family violence brokers. And we are always working in the space, and this is just a language we use. We're working in the mainstream family violence space because of the culture and intersection. And one of the things I have to say that became apparent over a couple of years was in Calgary, I'll only speak for Calgary because it's all I know, the mainstream family violence sector is designed around individualist Western feminist values, which I can get behind personally as a feminist, but it doesn't actually work for our clients. And I feel like there's a lot of values imposed in that space, which we have no position to impose those values when working with our clients, and especially because we work with dads. So Abbas was mentioning those entry points. That's our entry point. We work with men as fathers because they're involved with child welfare and have child welfare involvement. That is our entry point. And also, in a way, it's not mandatory, but in a way, it is mandatory because the system's involved. So that's a very big one. Standardized approach in the family violence sector, again, doesn't work for our families, and also it doesn't offer a culturally safe space for our families to exist in. And then there's always sort of a bit of a gap around resettlement. Like, is it a resettlement need or is it family violence? How to really identify the different categories of need. And a lack, again, of also additional reference points to culturally safe support. So go ahead, Catherine. So specifically, when we identified that need over the caseload, we hired a male family violence broker, again, to some of the points that my colleagues have made here, just to have to work with the inherent patriarchal nature of some of the families that we support. We needed a man to be able to speak to the men in the families. And so we did do that. We hired one male family violence broker, and additionally have since hired a corresponding female broker to do simultaneous workshops. But the reason we did this is because often, and I think all of you know this, I don't want to sort of repeat things that you already know, but when Children's Services is involved, their mandate is to protect the child. And so they have to protect the child, and then men are usually often or sometimes asked to leave and kind of sort it out. But they kind of get lost in the system sometimes. And we have found that moms were like, where's my husband? It's one really good example where there was a family and there was a domestic violence or family violence incident. The man had to leave, but the father was actually the only one that spoke English, and he was the financial earner. And he was the one that helped the kids with their homework. So at a certain point, the mom was just asking, she's like, can you bring my husband home? Because the kids need help with their homework. And we didn't actually know where the husband was. And so we couldn't even really tell her what was happening. So go ahead, Catherine. So at a certain point, after I think a year and a half, our family violence broker said, you know what these men need? And I think Abbas also mentioned it, is that they need time to cool down. Like, they need a minute to cool down and self-reflect. And during that time, we need to get in with them and be able to have a conversation with them and explain to them why they're in the system, what the system is doing, and how they're being affected in the system. And so we have the privilege, I would say, we have an apartment building that is a temporary accommodation in general. And so we took 2 of the apartments and turned it into cool down apartments for newcomer men experiencing family violence, so perpetrators of family violence. So when there's a child, when Children's Services is involved and the father's asked to leave, there's a criteria, of which actually I can go forward, Catherine. It's a pretty tight criteria. It's mostly newcomer men who actually don't recognize that they might be perpetrators of family violence, because they don't know the system or the definitions, and they don't know the consequences. And so it's pretty low risk. Like, you can't have, if there's mental health, it's an unsupervised apartment. So if there's mental health or medical conditions or addiction, we can't support that, and we're not experts, and we don't want to put anyone at risk. And so it's a very tight criteria of people. But we've actually had, in a year and a half, or maybe 2 years now, we've had 25 men go through there. Out of the 25, 10 have had criminal charges associated. And I think slightly more than half returned home, and some relocated. And just to mention someone else's, Oreika's myths about men, we've also had 2 male victims of family violence in the apartment, because there's also male victims of family violence, like she mentioned, but there are no beds in Calgary. There's one in rural Alberta for male victims. And so that's another need that has been identified. And for anybody that's interested, both the apartment and the brokerage program were nominated as National Promising Practices with P2P, and there are very long videos about both those projects in case anyone's interested in watching that. But I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Nurdine to talk about the actual content of the sessions. So Nur, if you want to turn your camera on. Oh, there.
Thank you so much, Amanda. My name is Nuruddin. I manage the cultural brokerage program with Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CIS, in partnership with Children's Services. Just for the context, we're not the clinical family violence counselors. We call ourselves proud with name with the family violence cultural brokers. So very much we work with only immigrant dads that are willing to engage with us, or who are not really taking other mandated, court-mandated family violence programs. We provide 3 basic educational sessions on family violence in the intersection with systems and culture. We provide the same content to both moms and dads, so we use fathers, male and female. The same content for the male, the male family violence, would work with the dad who are being welcomed at the apartments, while the moms, the women, will be working with the female cultural broker. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the content is the same, and we're unique in that term, that in that sense that we build in the both capacity of mom with the dad and the mother. Why this? Why dads to be working with the male family violence? Because based on our experience, as my colleague Amanda mentioned, out of the 25, we just found that out of the 25 dads, they were more engaged and open and trusting to having that sensitive conversation with the male family violence broker. And we only work with the dads who are really willing to change. We don't use the ways, we don't judge, we don't blame, and we don't use the mainstream family violence terms like a victim, perpetrator, and so on. We just, even if we have to give an example, we will never point to the dad. Even if we know about the protection concern and the incident, we just said, hey dad, hey father, just to make sure again, because we would like them to change. And that change, it comes really within not blaming, because in most cases, a dad will put all the blame on the mom or children. The first session, as I said, will really it's split into two. The main one for us is really we create that space for dad to share about their cultural journey, their immigration journey, if they came as a refugee, as a PR, as economic class, or family, as a visitor, if they have a status or not in Canada, because really this would really help us to hopefully address the situation after they finish the completed 3 sessions with us. If they need more sessions, we'll be more than happy to refer them to another mainstream organization. We share a lot of cultural practices back home versus in Canada, versus Canada. And the other part is really we give that free space for that to share the concern. What happened, what children's services or police got involved, and what were those triggers and stressors. The other part of the first session, we really focus on explaining, introducing systems, mainly the children's services, their mandate and why they got involved. In most cases, police as well, the same thing. We'll just give an overview of the police, because the way they've been seeing police back home is a bit different than here. We will share with them that police here is mainly ensuring that both mom and then the children being safe. We share about the court, and you know how hard to navigate the court system, even for the mainstream. So we would cover that part as well, shelters and other systems in country. And we always give us space, time for that to reflect. The second one is really, sorry, can we move to the second slide if it's possible? The second educational session is really focusing on the impact of family violence, mainly on children and the family at large. And in this one, really, we would ask dads about family violence, and you'll be surprised when we ask family violence, they always refer to the physical family violence, where, as you can see, in Canada, it's perceived different. There is the emotional part. This is the hardest one. And sometimes it's very challenging to explain it, introducing the emotional impact to the immigrant dads. We explain about the financial family violence, that one, because in most cases, if there is some cases where the dad is the provider, and there are some financial control over there, the sexual, and this is kind of challenging, because that's one of the reasons we have a dad to work with the male family violence, because they will create space for having this clear and frank conversation. And then we explained a lot about back home, how it's being perceived back home versus Canada, and what will we take that to accept, to change, and just realize the impact of all this sort of family violence on the children. And here we use a lot of videos. We use example case studies, and sometimes we ask open questions to the dad so we can have them more engaged. We talk about the child development stages and the brain development stages, and here really we would watch a video or two, and yes, we create that space for that to reflect. And the other component here in this session is really the strategy to manage stress. We all get stressed, and it's really what differentiates between a dad to another dad is strategy of managing stress. And here we mainly focus, if something incident happens, We share some strategy for leaving the house for time being, change the room, making a phone call, call a friend, or so on. So make sure it's not situation. Hopefully the incident will not go to get to a situation when the mom would have to call the police. And usually, culturally, when a mom calls the police, the expectation just to say, okay, stop it, don't do it again. But in Canada is a bit different. When the police are here, I believe they have to do their job. The charges may be laid and so on. There will be some implications. That's what we would explain to that if an incident happens. And the third and last family educational session is really focused on healthy, unhealthy relationship and communication, the importance of communication between mom and dad. In here, it's really, we would ask dad about how he perceived, defined healthy, unhealthy, and the relationship with the wife prior to coming to Canada, and what led to that incident where either children's services or Calgary police been involved. And here again, we create that space for that to talk about all those triggers. Being newcomers, been mentioned by my colleagues here, there are a lot of triggers, stressors leading to a family violence situation. And the second component is really we'll talk about the power control. And here really, in some cases, we'll focus on the financial control, the education, language, and the job landing in Canada. And here, because there is a case with our experiences with a dad would belittle the wife because either she's not working or she doesn't have education or she stays home. So very much we just build that capacity and hope that the dad would change some of these behaviors and practices. We share the importance of really co-sharing, because having children in the West in general, there is the notion of really co-parenting, co-sharing of the daily routines between mom and dad, because in our cases, the moms are overwhelmed. It could be a situation they cannot handle it, and would really push them either to call a police or leave the house, or one of the children will call police because there is an incident and unhealthy relationship. And the communication is extremely important. And here when it says communication is both ways, and it should be a ongoing communication. If there is an incident, if one of the parents is not feeling good about something, we would like them to talk about it, to share it, and find a way of really discussing it and resolving that situation before really having the system and the authority to get involved. It's all about respect. Thank you. I believe because of the time, so I have a lot to say, but I have a lot of cases, but I said it's better just a little bit for a question if you have. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Noor. And Amanda, that was wonderful. So in the interest of time, just point out that the last couple of informational slides here have some resources and information that you can access if you're doing programming, especially from the Neighbors, Friends and Family campaign, and also from the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women. There's a lot of women and children. There's a lot of resources there at Western University about engaging men and boys. And really want to thank the presenters today for all the different ways that they work with men and boys, and we're able to come and share with us today all those different ways to engage and entry points for men, and how to make programming interesting, and how to respond if somebody's in crisis. So I'll just invite the speakers to come back on with your cameras, videos, and such, and we'll wave goodbye to the audience. Thank you, audience, for participating today. Really appreciate it. And have a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks everyone.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Good job, everyone.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Fatty.
Bye, thank you.
Bye. Thanks. Bye, Veronica. Nice to meet you.
So nice meeting you.
Take care. Bye-bye.